Learning is a relatively enduring change in an individual's behavior, right? So learning traditionally in the Indian, you think of it as uh, something that you studied, right? Some new information, but it's also a change in behavior. And relatively enduring, meaning that it stays for a while. It's not permanent, but it's not very temporary either, right? There are four types of learning. Habituation is a basic type, and then there is classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and uh, socio-cognitive theory or observational learning or whatever different names are there for it, right? Uh, Habituation is the decrease in the strength of a response due to repeated stimulation, right? So habituation is basically a particular response will keep decreasing, right? If it gets used to the stimulus. So think of like, say when you saw that ad of Rahul Dravid getting really angry at the traffic and all that, right? And the new cred ad, it became really famous. So initially you enjoyed it, your responses of excitation when you saw the stimulus, but when you kept seeing it, it started to irritate you, right? So that's habituation. The decrease in the strength of a response, the strength of a response in this case was excitement, the decrease in excitement each time you saw the stimulus, right? So that's one kind of learning, very basic kind of learning. Then you have classical conditioning, which is the more important kind of learning. This is something that we all know that it takes place when there is an unconditioned stimulus, which evokes an unconditioned response. So there is an unconditioned stimulus, which is already eliciting a response, right? When this unconditioned stimulus is associated with the neutral stimulus, it still gives you the unconditioned response. Over time, these two things get associated. So the neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned stimulus by itself evokes the same response as the unconditioned stimulus, but this response is now referred to as the conditioned response, right? So you have unconditioned stimulus leading to unconditioned response, unconditioned stimulus plus a neutral stimulus leading to unconditioned response. Neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus over time. The conditioned stimulus gives the conditioned response, which is the same as the unconditioned response. The only reason it's referred to as the conditioned response is because it's being evoked by the conditioned stimulus, right? This was found by Ivan Pavlov. He gave the basic principles of classical conditioning, and then people have elaborated on it after him, right? So an unconditioned stimulus, UCS, US student UCS, is a stimulus that leads to a response, right? An unconditioned response. Unconditioned response is an involuntary response to an unconditioned stimulus. A neutral stimulus is a stimulus that has no specific response. A conditioned stimulus is when the neutral stimulus takes on the role of the unconditioned stimulus and becomes capable of producing the unconditioned response, right? So one of the example of Pavlov is food, salivation, food plus bell, salivation, bell, food get associated, bell by itself produces salivation in the dogs, right? So this is the basic structure. You have unconditioned stimulus leading to unconditioned response. Neutral stimulus plus unconditioned stimulus becomes the unconditioned response. Neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus is supposed to be CS, right? And CS becomes a gives evokes the CR, right? Acquisition is this period, the period of learning where this neutral stimulus can be referred to as the conditioned stimulus, right? Basic classical conditioning, very simple, very straightforward thing, right? Um, Now, there are different types of conditioning that exist. This is very, very important, right? From the net perspective, very important to understand that there are four different ways in which conditioning takes place, classical conditioning takes place, right? There is forward conditioning, backward conditioning. Forward conditioning has two types within it, right? Called delayed conditioning and trace conditioning, right? If the question is which is the fastest type of conditioning, you'll say it is delayed conditioning, okay? In delayed conditioning, what happens is the conditioned stimulus, that is the neutral stimulus, right, is presented before the unconditioned stimulus, right? But they overlap in their timing. So say you're ringing a bell, right? And then you give the food. But while you're giving the food, you're still ringing the bell, but your ringing is coming to an end. So suppose you're ringing the bell for 1 minute, you ring it, in the 50th second, you start giving the food, right? And then once you reach 60 seconds, you stop ringing the bell and you give the food and the dogs will salivate, right? So this is known as delayed conditioning, where the neutral stimulus is paired with the unconditioned stimulus such that the neutral stimulus comes before the unconditioned stimulus, but their timings overlap, where the neutral stimulus towards its end, the unconditioned stimulus starts to be shown, right? And then it gives it creates the association and the unconditioned response takes place. Eventually, very quickly, when you just ring the bell, dogs will start to salivate, right? That's delayed conditioning. Then you have trace conditioning. Here again, it's a kind of forward conditioning. What's happening here is that the neutral stimulus is given before the unconditioned stimulus, similar to delayed conditioning, except that there is a gap in time. So you ring the bell for 60 seconds, then you wait for 10 seconds, and then in the 70th second you give the food, and then it leads to salivation. Now trace conditioning takes a little bit longer than delayed conditioning in terms of creating the association, but it's still a very powerful form of conditioning. Okay. Then there are two other types of conditioning called simultaneous conditioning and backward conditioning. Simultaneous conditioning suggests that both the bell ringing and the food is given together. So the neutral stimulus and food is given together at the same time for the same length of time. So they're simultaneous, right? Very easy to understand. And then you have backward conditioning. In backward conditioning, you give the food first, then you ring the bell, and then you and then the salivation thing takes place, right? Now, there are lots of variations where net will ask you this in terms of say match the following, or he'll ask you which is the fastest or which is the slowest. The slowest is backward conditioning, fastest is forward conditioning. Even if they ask you within forward conditioning, the fastest form of conditioning is delayed conditioning, right? Now, four types, again, I'm repeating four types of conditioning, right? Actually, three types: forward, backward, simultaneous. But forward is of two types: delayed, trace. Delayed and trace is similar, except that in delayed, the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus overlap, and in trace, the overlapping does not take place. The neutral stimulus is provided before the unconditioned stimulus, whereas in backward conditioning, the unconditioned stimulus is provided before the neutral stimulus, right? So you have to remember this, very important, usually comes for your exam, right? Now, other concepts in classical conditioning is of extinction, right? This is where the learned response starts to get weaker because the unconditioned stimulus is not shown. So if you keep ringing the bell, the dog will keep salivating, but over time, the association with the food breaks down and the dogs will stop salivating to the ringing of the bell, right? That is called extinction. That is that the conditioned stimulus no longer evokes the conditioned response. The CS is not releasing the CR, right? Because the unconditioned stimulus does not take place, right? So that's extinction. That is the weakening or the disappearance of the learned response, right? Because the unconditioned stimulus has been removed. Then there is spontaneous recovery. This is, suppose you rang the bell, okay? The dog salivated for a while, then they stopped salivating, right? And then suddenly after like 10 days, you rang the bell and you provided food, the dog started to salivate again. Then the day after that, if you just rang the bell, the dogs will continue to salivate. So this is the recovery of the conditioning, right? So the reappearance of a learned response after the extinction has occurred if the UCS is presented again. I'm very happy to report to you the electricity is back. Okay. Uh, then you have generalization, right? Generalization is the tendency to respond to stimuli that are similar to the original conditioned stimulus with the conditioned response. So, say for example, someone is scared of a ball, right? Suppose what has happened in their life is somebody has thrown a ball at them, right? And then they try to catch it, and then it no, that's not the right example. Wait, let me think. Say somebody was playing cricket, right? They were playing cricket and they had a bat, and then one fine day they saw that a snake was wriggling on the bat, right? And then they saw that they got really scared, they threw the bat and they ran away. Every time after that they saw the bat, right, they used to get really scared and anxious because the association of the bat was with the snake, right? over time, what started to happen is anything that looks like the bat. So if there is like someone washing clothes and hitting the clothes with that particular device, right? Or if they see something that is shaped like a bat, they start to get really anxious, right? So the idea is that they've generalized the conditioned stimulus to everything. The original conditioned stimulus was just one bat, that particular bat where the snake was there. But over time, they've generalized it to all types of bat, and then maybe they've generalized to everything that looks like a bat also over time, right? So that's generalization, the tendency to respond to stimuli that are similar to the original conditioned stimulus, right? Very important. Then there is discrimination, where the responses of the stimulus is limited only to the conditioned stimulus and no other stimulus. So sometimes when you're doing classical conditioning, what might happen is the person might only respond to a particular kind of bell. So for example, the dogs, right? If you rang one bell, only to that bell they would salivate. If there is some other kind of bell that is rung, they will not salivate, right? So that's being discriminatory in terms of the kind of conditioned stimulus that they are responding to, right? Then you have something called higher order conditioning. This is very interesting. This is where there is already a conditioned stimulus, right? And then you pair a new neutral stimulus with this conditioned stimulus, and then the new neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus, right? So initially what is going on? There is unconditioned stimulus, neutral stimulus. They get paired, neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus, and it gives the conditioned response. Higher order conditioning is a step ahead of this, where the conditioned stimulus is linked to the new neutral stimulus, and then this new neutral stimulus takes the role of the conditioned stimulus and evokes a response. So for example, this case of the bat and the snake, right? So there's the bat, which is the neutral stimulus. It got linked with the snake, which gave the reaction of anxiety, right? Of fear. Now, if, for example, the next time this person is holding a bat, right, they are also wearing a wristband, for example, right? They see a bat and then they're just walking around and then they hit the bat and they get anxious and then they see that they're wearing a blue color wristband, right? They might start to get anxiety on that blue color wristband also, right? So that's a neutral stimulus that has been paired with a conditioned stimulus, which is the bat, which is actually paired with the unconditioned stimulus, that is the snake, right? Now, naturally, this conditioning is going to be much more weaker than the original neutral stimulus because obviously it's one step behind, right? These are weaker and these extinguish much faster. Now, there are two understandings of classical conditioning. One is that according to Pavlov, when he was doing research in the 50s, 60s, he said that it's the same part of the brain where the association takes place. So there is already an unconditioned stimulus which is giving rise to an unconditioned response. When you do classical conditioning, the unconditioned stimulus is replaced by the conditioned stimulus, right? And therefore, that pairing is giving result to the conditioned response or the unconditioned response, right? Um, but now we know that that's not really the case. You can't remove a conditioned stimulus and replace and all of that. That doesn't really happen. So the cognitive perspective explains this by saying that whenever there is a conditioned stimulus, right, there is always the expectancy of the unconditioned stimulus. And that expectancy is releasing the conditioned response or the unconditioned response, right? So the cognitive perspective is based on the expectancy model, saying that whenever the neutral stimulus or the conditioned stimulus is presented, right, the person or the object or the thing or whatever that being is expects the unconditioned stimulus to occur as well, right? That expectation triggers the evocation of the response. Pavlov's assumption was that in the brain, right, there are associations, right? And there's already an association of unconditioned response, unconditioned stimulus to an unconditioned response. Say again, take the example of the snake and fear, right? It's already there, right? What he's saying is that when you got scared with the bat, the unconditioned stimulus of snake was replaced by bat, and therefore when you see bat, you get anxiety, right? That was his assumption. That pairing created substitution, basically, right? In today's world, in the cognitive perspective, the idea is that when you have, say, that snake gives rise to fear, and then it gets paired with bat. What's happening is when somebody sees a bat, they are already expecting a snake to come out of it, right? And therefore, it's already eliciting a your fear. Basically, the behavior of fear is already being elicited, or anxiety is already being elicited, because the person is expecting a snake to come out, right? So that's the idea. Right now, operant conditioning is it's actually more straightforward than classical conditioning, because operant conditioning is dependent. It takes place only after the behavior. It can never occur before a behavior, right? So only after the behavior, the response dictates the kind of conditioning, right? So operant meaning after the operating behavior, right? So it refers to learning of voluntary behavior. Again, yesterday we realized classical conditioning was more about involuntary behavior. Operant conditioning is more about voluntary behavior, and the response after the behavior, if it's pleasant or unpleasant, determines how likely someone is to continue that particular behavior, right? Sometimes that particular behavior gets generalized to similar types of behavior, but usually it's limited to that behavior, right? So for instance, one of the examples is somebody studying, right? You study because after the exam your parents have promised to buy you a bike or bicycle or something, right? So you are engaging in the behavior of studying, because the response of that, the consequence of that behavior is positive, and therefore you're going to continue behaving in the way that you are, right? The other reason you might study is that your parents will say, if you don't study, I'll hit you, right? So you're trying to avoid being hit, right? So that's another kind of consequence. So the behavior, nothing before the behavior is important. It's only after the behavior and the consequence that determines the strength of a particular kind of learning, right? So usually this is in terms of rewards or punishments, or what is known as reinforcement or punishment. The person who gave us this concept was Skinner, right? Um, Before Skinner, actually Thorndike had spoken about something similar. It was known as the law of effect, right? So the law of effect stated that it was very simple and straightforward. So Skinner complicated it a little bit. He made it more sophisticated. But Thorndike's law of effect is, in essence, the basic theme of operant conditioning. Thorndike's law of effect was that if a particular behavior, if a particular response, right, is followed by a pleasurable consequence, it will continue to be repeated. If it is followed by an unpleasant consequence, it will not be repeated, right? So the key difference is that he spoke only in terms of positive reinforcement and positive punishment, right? Positive reinforcement meaning the consequence is pleasurable, therefore this particular behavior will be repeated. Positive punishment meaning that the consequence will be unpleasant, therefore a response will not be repeated, right? So positive response will increase the same behavior, but negative response will decrease the same behavior, right? Um, Now the issue is the two. One is this is very simple. It's not as simple as this, right? We use reinforcement in multiple other ways. And secondly, his it was a law, right? So a law is not like a theory. A law is like gravity. It exists, right? So similarly, Thorndike's law of effect was supposed to exist across the spectrum. So when he said that if a particular behavior is followed by an unpleasant stimulus, unpleasant consequence, it will not be repeated, right? But that's not necessarily the case. Like even when somebody commits an act of crime or anything that they're not supposed to, right, or immoral behavior or whatever, which creates a unpleasant consequence, sometimes they repeat that behavior even though there is unpleasant consequence, right? So it's not a sure shot guarantee. It's not that if there is something unpleasant that happens, it will not be repeated, right? It's not like that. It's not like if you punish somebody, they will no longer do that particular act, right? It's not like that. So that's where Thorndike's law of effect was far too simple, and Skinner did enough experiments after that to sort of make it even more sophisticated, right? So according to Skinner and operant conditioning, there are two consequences to a behavioral response, right? The first is reinforcement. So reinforcement is basically any behavior that gets strengthened because of its consequence is reinforcement, right? Any particular behavior that gets strengthened because of a consequence is reinforcement. The consequence doesn't have to be positive or negative, right? That's not what it says. It says a behavior that gets repeated, that gets strengthened because of a response is reinforcement. Now the response can be of two types. That is positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Positive reinforcement is where you add something pleasurable at the end of a behavior. So you study, parents give you bike, chocolate, hugs, love, admiration, whatever, right? Anything positive that is the consequence of a particular behavior will increase the strength of that behavior, right? So that's positive reinforcement. Sometimes the reinforcement is that something unpleasant won't happen, right? If something unpleasant can be avoided after engaging in a certain behavior, that behavior will also start to get strengthened, right? That is called negative reinforcement. So this is very important, okay? This is not punishment. Negative reinforcement means that this particular behavior of studying will get strengthened. But the reason it will get strengthened is not because something unpleasant will be put. It will be because something unpleasant will be removed. Okay, so you'll study so that you don't get hit, right? So this is negative reinforcement. You'll continue to study because the unpleasant consequence of being hit is being removed, right? So if you're engaging in the act of studying over and over and over again, either because you're going to get positively reinforced that your parents are going to give you something, or because your parents are not going to hurt you or somebody else is not going to hurt you, right? Both of those behaviors are increasing the behavior of both of those consequences are increasing the behavior of studying, right? So it's reinforcing the behavior of studying. Okay, so whenever you see the word reinforcement, it means that particular behavior is going to get repeated or it's going to get strengthened. Now it might get repeated or strengthened because of two types of consequences. One is the positive type where a particular consequence adds pleasure, is like it's a pleasurable consequence of your behavior, or is the removal of an unpleasant situation of a behavior. Okay, very important. The other type of conditioning takes place because of punishment. Punishment means that a particular behavior is going to get weak because of its consequence, right? So punishment means that a particular behavior is going to get weak, that it will not get repeated again and again and again because something happens after that behavior is engaged in, right? Now punishment, there are two types of consequences again. One is very simple and straightforward, that is you do something that you're not supposed to, right? Suppose you cheat in an exam and then the university tells you, please, you're rusticated, we don't acknowledge this sort of thing, please leave the university, you don't get a degree, right? That's positive punishment, meaning that you're experiencing a addition of an unpleasant consequence. What is the unpleasant consequence? The fact that you're being removed from university, right? So your behavior of cheating will start to decrease. Next time you're giving an exam, you will think twice before cheating, right? That's because positive punishment has taken place, right? So positive punishment is the weakening of a response, weakening of a behavior because the consequence is unpleasant. So unpleasant consequences added to the situation and therefore you decrease this particular kind of behavior. Okay. Now, the most confusing part of all of this is negative punishment, right? That's primarily because when we hear negative and punishment, it's like it confuses us, right? Because the semantics of those two words are supposed to mean something else altogether, right? But in operant conditioning, negative punishment is again the weakening of a response because something pleasurable is removed. So when someone gets grounded, right, what's happened to them? Suppose they again cheated in an exam, for example, right? They cheated in an exam and then they came home, school scolded them and all that, and then told the parents, you deal with this, right? So when the child came home, parents said that, okay, you cheated, therefore you will not get to watch TV for 1 week, or you will not get to play games for 1 week, or you will not get to meet your friends for 1 week, or you will not get to go out for 1 week. So the next time this person goes to cheat, they'll think, oh my God, again, I will not go to meet my friends. I'll not get to watch TV. Forget it. I will not cheat. Right? What's happened? The negative, the behavior has reduced, the behavior of cheating has gotten weakened because something pleasurable has been removed from there, right? Now, this pleasurable activity can be anything, right? So, these are the four types of operant conditioning, right? Positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, negative punishment, right? One of the favorite questions that again Net puts forward is when is punishment most effective? Right? We know that punishment is not as effective as reinforcement. Okay, so reinforcement is always going to be stronger than punishment. However, there are certain circumstances where positive punishment is very effective. Right? Not always, but negative punishment is usually more effective than positive punishment. So remember this: reinforcement is stronger than punishment. Within punishment, negative punishment is stronger in terms of its effects, it's longer lasting than positive punishment. However, positive punishment has immediate effect, it doesn't have long lasting effect. And if you want positive punishment to be effective, there are three important criteria for it to be so. One, that the punishment must come immediately after the behavior, right? So somebody cheats and immediately they get rusticated or they get or some kind of positive punishment takes place. Very important, very effective, right? The person can draw a line, draw a parallel between cause and effect. Second, when they get punished, the reason should remain consistent. It should not be dependent on the other person's mood, right? It should be consistently about something that they did incorrectly or they didn't do properly, right? If the reasonings are consistent and it's more situation based than person based, then again it has a lot of effect. And third, when they are taught the right behavior after the punishment, right? So if they cheat, then they get punished, and then next time they're explained what they should do properly, right, and what they shouldn't do, then it's very effective, right? So three things: immediately after a behavior, the reason should remain consistent each time they're being punished, right? Not the same reasons, but the consistency of the reason, right? The larger framework. And they are taught what the right behavior is. Oftentimes you'll see that people get punished, especially kids get punished, and then they will not be told what the right behavior is, right? So that sort of it reduces the impact of uh, the consequence. It reduces the impact of the behavior reducing itself, right? So very important. Okay, now in within operant conditioning, there are two types of reinforcers. Okay, there is primary reinforcer these are just biologically wired reinforcers, right? So if you feel hungry and then you eat, primary reinforcer, right? Sex, primary reinforcer. Sleep, primary reinforcer, right? Anything that your body biologically needs, air, primary reinforcer, right? So these are biologically based reinforcers. And then there are secondary reinforcers, right? Things that are paired with primary reinforcers, which affect us also, right? So money is a classic example. Money by itself is just paper, it has no value, right? But because it's attached to so many of our needs, including food, water, sleep, all of these things, right? It becomes a reinforcer. So money becomes important. Okay, so there are two types basically in terms of reinforcers. There are primary ones which are basically biology based, and then secondary reinforcers is anything that affects you. So your say your relationship, romance, love. I don't know. Love is not biological. That much is true. So even love is a secondary reinforcer in a way, right? The reasons you try and maintain a relationship apart from just the basic biological purposes, secondary reinforcer. Um, your say friendship secondary reinforcer, right? Not biologically needed. So basically, it's basic needs and everything else above it, right? Now, operant conditioning also has extinction, like classical conditioning. This is the weakening or the disappearance of a response because it's no longer reinforced or punished, right? So, weakening of a response. So, weakening of a response meaning that if it was a strong response, the consequence is not taking place, that gets weakened. If it was a punished response, that means it was already weak, but if the consequences are no longer existing, it might increase, right? So when they say weakening of a response or disappearance of a response, it's the response that was either reinforced or punished going in the opposite direction because the consequence no longer exists. So it's not that operant extinction only exists for reinforced behaviors, it also exists for punished behaviors. Okay. And when they say weakening, they are saying this in terms of this is separate from the weakening that takes place in punishment. In punishment, weakening means that there is a reduction in that behavior. In this case, weakening means that the consequence is no longer affecting the behavior. Therefore, that behavior might increase in terms of punishment at least, right? So resistance to extinction is the degree to which non-reinforced responses persist. Now shaping, okay, this is very important. Shaping is basically it involves the use of successive approximations towards the attainment of a final response. So if you want, say, one of the things that Skinner himself did was he trained birds and all to fly to places. He trained pigeons to move their heads from right to left in order to get food. If they move from left to right, he wouldn't give them food, right? So shaping is basically using successive approximation. So successive approximation is smaller steps to attain the final step, right? So if there was the pigeon, for example, if it looked here, Skinner would give them one morsel to eat, right? And then if it moved that side, he wouldn't reinforce. And then if they moved a little bit this side, he would reinforce, right? If they moved back here, he wouldn't reinforce. And then they moved here, he wouldn't reinforce. But if they moved here, he would reinforce, right? And so on and so forth till they turned this way. Slowly, the birds began to understand that they have to move their heads from here all the way here to get food, right? So that's shaping, where you there is a goal, right? To reach the goal, there are smaller goals that are put and that are reinforced. So the person keeps getting reinforced with these smaller goals. When they reach the final goal, then this entire sequence is sort of reinforced and then they engage in this behavior, right? So successive approximation are small steps that are involved in shaping. Shaping is the reaching of a final goal by using small steps of conditioning, right? Chaining, on the other hand, works the other way. So it works backward. So there is the final goal that you want someone to reach, and then there are all these goals that they have to reach before they reach here, right? And you reinforce them backwards. So you develop a sequence or chain of responses by reinforcing each response in order to perform the next response. So usually starts with the final response and works backwards. Okay, so in that case, bird has to eat morsel here, and then they'll sort of feed that way, and then they have to move like that, right? So that's chaining basically, right? So shaping is small steps, successive approximation. Chaining might not involve successive approximations, right? It's just a sequence of events that works backwards, right? So exactly opposite. Then you have escape conditioning, which is learning of a response in order to terminate an aversive stimulus or a consequence, right? So this is built on negative reinforcement. This is basically where, say, what they do in rehabs is they take people who are abusing drugs or alcohol or whatever, right? They give them a medication that's going to make them nauseous and pukeish, okay? And then they give them the thing that gives them the kick. So usually this happens with alcohol. They'll give them a little bit of alcohol. They'll have the alcohol and then they'll start to feel nauseous and pukeish and all of that, right? So what they're essentially saying is that like that alcohol is causing you that, right? So it's the removal of, like, if you reduce that behavior. No, I gave you the wrong example, sorry, right? So in aversive conditioning, basically an unpleasant situation is being removed, right? So what they'll do is they'll give them alcohol, right? Suppose someone is addicted to alcohol, they'll give them alcohol, right? And then they'll drink alcohol, and then the person will come in and say that I'll give you this medication, it will remove, and then like they'll have that medication to puke, right? That unpleasant stimulus. The doctors will come in saying if you stop drinking, I'll give you this medication that will stop your puking altogether, right? So then the person no longer engages in continuous drinking. So what's happening with someone who's an alcoholic is basically they're not done with like one peg or two pegs, right? They'll have bottles. So when they have that first peg, in order to terminate them from having like larger amounts of alcohol, initially they'll be given a medication that will make them nauseous. They'll drink. They'll start to feel pukish, right? Unpleasant situation. Doctor will come say, you take this medication. Only if you stop drinking now, you can have this medication and your unpleasant stimulus will be gone, right? Generally, most people obviously they don't want to be puking all the time, so they'll have that medication. And then because they promised that they will not drink, they'll have to stop, right? So that's a form of escape conditioning. Then there is avoidance conditioning. This is learns to avoid an aversive stimulus leading because of the relief of avoidance itself, right? This is one of the things that happens with people who have anxiety, right? they'll avoid the situation altogether because avoiding the situation gives them relief, right? Saying that, oh, I thank God I didn't go out today, right? So it's a self-reinforcing sort of belief, which is very problematic, but that's what happens to a lot of people with anxiety, right? This idea was propagated by Richard Solomon. Basically, there are two larger types of schedules. One is continuous and another is partial. When you say continuous reinforcement, what you're saying is that every behavior is going to get reinforced. So every time somebody does X behavior, they'll get chocolate. Every time, right? So that's continuous reinforcement. Sometimes, most times, you can't do that, right? Because continuous reinforcement over time starts to reduce the effect, right? If its effectiveness will drop. Because each time if somebody does something, they're going to get chocolate again and again and again. The value of that chocolate will also decrease and the effect it has on the behavior will also decrease, right? So continuous reinforcement is not that good in the long term, right? Partial reinforcement does a better job long term, right? However, partial reinforcement itself is divided into two types, which itself is divided into two types, right? So you have interval reinforcement and ratio reinforcement, right? Partial interval and partial ratio. So partial interval is based on time, right? After a certain amount of time, the person will be reinforced with the consequence or punishment, right? And ratio is after a certain number of behavior, they'll be reinforced. Okay. So interval is time based. Ratio is behavior, the amount of work, right? That the unit of work is what determines the ratio, right? Whereas interval is time based. Now interval itself can be fixed time based or variable time based, which is basically after every 5 seconds they'll get reinforced, that is fixed. Variable is at random, right? Sometimes 3 seconds, sometimes 7 seconds, sometimes 9 seconds, like that. Ratio is also similar. Fixed meaning every 3 times they perform a particular behavior, they'll get reinforced. Variable is again random, right? Sometimes 2, sometimes 7, sometimes 9. So continuous reinforcement is every response is reinforced. Partial reinforcement is based on ratio, that is a certain takes place certain percentage or number of responses have occurred or takes place after a certain amount of time interval has passed, right? Now fixed schedules are reinforcement takes place after a fixed amount of times or trials, and variable schedules are reinforcement takes place after a certain number of time. Fixed is trials, right? So if you look at this, this is the best way to explain this, right? You have fixed ratio schedule, which is reinforcement occurs after a fixed number of responses, right? So this is, say, salesmen and all have this, right? Where if you sell X number of pencils, then you will get extra bonus, right? So that's a fixed ratio, saying that if you sell 10, you will get bonus, right? So what this, the effect of this is that it produces a high rate of responses but is followed by burst pause burst pattern, which is basically when they hit 10 they'll be really active to get 10, but after that to get the next 10 they'll be like, oh my god, I have to do 10 more, right? So they'll pause until like slowly it builds up to 7, 5, 6, 7, and then they might again have a burst pattern, right? So the response initially is very quick, but it has that pattern where it increases and drops and increases and drops. Okay. Then you have variable ratio, where reinforcement occurs after a certain number of responses, which is varying, right? So this is a slot machine, basically. You keep putting coin and you don't know at which point it might release the money, right? Variable ratio is very, very good as a system because it produces a high rate of behavior, of response of that particular behavior, and it keeps it going for a long time because you don't know when the consequence is going to come, right? And each time the consequence comes, it increases your tendency to behave the same way, right? The only trick is that the variable nature of it should not be too vast, right? There should not be too much gap. Then you have fixed interval, which is basically reinforcement will occur after a fixed time period has passed. So your salary will get increased every 6 months, right? That's a fixed interval. So there are 6 months that you have to work, then your salary is going to increase, right? Now here response increase as the time for the next reinforcement nears. So when you get the job, okay, you'll be excited naturally, but then by the second month onwards, you'll start not doing that well, not doing that well. And then when you are in the 4.5 month or 5th month, you'll start to really perform very well because the salary date is coming, right? Fixed thing. And then you might expect a raise. Or if you don't do well, then you realize, oh, they might not give me a raise, right? So when the reinforcement time nears, you start to perform better, right? And then you have variable interval where this occurs at random, right? But based on time. So uh, students, when they get surprise exams, this is what this is, right? This is what variable interval is. The thing with variable interval is that it's never very high. The reinforcement strength is not very high. Neither is it very low. It just keeps the person constantly on their toes, right? They're constantly doing the same kind of work and they're constantly being motivated, right? So depending on the kind of question you're asked, you have to remember the effects, right? If the question is which type of reinforcement is the fastest way to strengthen a behavior, right? You'll say fixed ratio, right? If they say which is the best way to keep the behavior going upwards, right? Keep strengthening the behavior, you'll say variable ratio. Which is the kind of behavior where where the strengthening of the behavior takes place before the next reinforcer, you'll say fixed interval, right? And which is the kind of reinforcement where the behavior is more or less consistent and doesn't increase or decrease too much, you'll say variable interval schedule. Now, apart from operant conditioning, there were other types of learning that is there, which is sort of similar ideas. But these are again questions that Ned loves asking, right? There is insight learning that was given to us by Kohler. His idea was where that people learn things where suddenly they'll have like an aha moment, right? So this was referred to as like an insight learning or cognitive learning. So they'll try different ways to solve a problem, and then suddenly they'll have a moment of insight where all of that will just come together and they'll learn how to do the right way, right, or behave in the right way. So this was that study, if you'll remember, an ape was there and they gave like two sticks actually, which could be put into one another, right? And then but they kept them separately inside the cage, and then they hung a banana, and then the ape was trying to get the banana and it was jumping, but it couldn't reach, right? And then it tried to take one stick and it tried to get it one stick, then it tried to throw sticks, it tried all of those things. And it just sat down and suddenly it realized that it could put the two sticks inside one another and then reach the banana, right? And it did that and then it reached the banana. So this was the idea of insight learning. Saying that suddenly you have these more aha moments where you might learn, right? So that was Kohler. Then you had Edward Tolman, who spoke about latent learning and cognitive maps. So Tolman's idea was based out of rats, right? So these were the maze experiments where rats were like food was placed at the end of the maze and rats were asked to figure out their route, and they were just left inside the maze and they figured out the route how to get to the food, right? And one of the two things that took place was that when like some rats, there was no way they were going to reach the food, right? So the two ways were divided basically. Some rats, for them, the maze was constructed in a way where they would reach food. Some rats, there was no way in which they were ever going to reach the food, right? But they were still trying their best within the maze, right? So two things were noticed from this study. One was that when you took the rats that didn't get food and you put them in the right place, right, where they could reach food, they figured out how to reach the food space very quickly, right? Compared to other novice rats, right? Or other rats who put in the cage in the maze for the first time. This gave us an idea that there is something called latent learning, saying that even when you're doing something and it's not having a consequence, it's still somehow you're still learning the pattern of the maze, right? Therefore, when you got chance to reach the food, you reach there faster than someone who had never been on that maze before, right? So that's latent learning. Cognitive map was when the maze was also removed, some of the rats still took the same way to reach the food, right? Which was basically that they had the map of the entire maze in their heads and they followed that same pattern irrespective of what the structure was, right? So this was Stolman. He gave us latent learning and cognitive maps. Then you had Seligman. Seligman is the father of positive psychology, right? He gave us the idea of learned helplessness, which is basically a mental state where an individual continues to take on very painful consequences and aversive consequences uh, because they do not think they can escape from it and that they don't think that it can be controlled or avoided, right? So two important reasons why learned helplessness takes place. One is that they cannot escape the situation. Second is that it cannot be controlled or avoided, right? It's the way of the world. Basically, that's the idea. So, learned helplessness is also a form of learning, right? Where you learn to take on painful stimuli. You're unwilling, but you learn to take it because you think there's no getting out of this, nor is there a way you can control or avoid this, right? Now, operant conditioning is slightly simpler than uh, observational learning, sorry, is slightly simpler than operant conditioning. Um, Over time, its name has just evolved into different things depending on the time that we find ourselves in. That's primarily because Bandura is still alive, so he wants to be in the new lingo. So now it's called the social cognitive theory. Earlier it was observational learning. Before that it was imitation learning. And then there are, I think, other two, three names also, right? This is basically how one learns when they observe other people and take on certain behaviors and then sort of modify them and behave according to that, or they imitate someone else's behavior completely, right? So it works in two ways basically. One is when you observe someone's behavior, try and inculcate that. When you observe and inculcate, you're not imitating, right? You're learning something from it and then trying to manifest that in your own life. Or you copy exactly, right? You imitate. Now, his famous experiment was the Bobo doll experiment, where children saw violent participants and then you try to see whether they would imitate that behavior or not, right? Now, most important question in terms of net is this: what are the four steps that are involved in observational learning, right? The first steps is first, you pay attention to what you want to model, that particular behavior. Then you remember what you want to model, that is retention. Then you reproduce that behavior. So you practice the model behavior, right? And then motivation, that is you behave, you find situations where that behavior is a required thing, right? So you remain motivated to continue that behavior over time, right? So one of the examples is, for example, I used to be a really sloppy eater of a burger, right? And my best friend was like really clean, very clean, still is obviously. um, so I tried to learn, but obviously I can't say I want to learn how to eat a burger from you. That's a weird thing to say. So I observed how he was eating it, right? And then I figured out a few of the things that you're supposed to do with your hands while you're holding the burger, how you're supposed to eat, how it may not drip, etc. Right? So I paid attention. Then I remembered all of it. Then when I was eating a burger, I reproduced it, right? And then now whenever I eat a burger, I remain motivated to not be sloppy, unless probably when I'm alone where it's okay to be sloppy, right? So one of the ways I remember this is by saying art rep, right? You can remember it as ARRM. You can remember this as George R.R. Martin, right? Where G is actually A. So whatever is the best way for you to remember it, remember it. But don't get confused between retention and reproduction, right? Retention will always come before reproduction. So attention, retention, reproduction, motivation. Now, observational learning takes place in two ways. One is imitation, like I told you, that is copying someone else's behavior. Modeling is where you observe someone else and then you see what you want to copy from them. So they become the model, right? You're not necessarily imitating them. Bandura, after in the later years, also came up with the self-efficacy theory, which was the individual's belief about their own capability to produce desired outcomes. So their own self-belief about their abilities, basically, right? In recent years, we figured out that there's no single part of the brain that controls learning. However, hypothalamus and dopamine pathways are mostly involved, right? These are two important centers, but apart from that, we're not very sure how. There's no single part of the brain that, because you're learning so many things, right? There's no one single part of the brain. However, if the question is asked, hypothalamus is an option, you select hypothalamus, right?